The wind in Silver Mesa did not blow so much as it scoured. It came sweeping down from the northern peaks, gathering speed across miles of flat, broken tablelands until it hit the town with the force of a physical blow. It carried the taste of grit and ancient dust, coating the tongue and stinging the eyes. The earth here was dry, a patchwork of cracked mud and brittle sagebrush that clung to the soil with desperate, woody roots. Above, the sky was a vast, terrifying dome of hard blue, empty save for the circling shapes of hawks hunting for anything that moved and the towering formations of storm clouds that piled up on the horizon every afternoon, promising thunder but rarely delivering the mercy of rain. It was 1878, and the territory was unforgiving. Silver Mesa was a town built on hope but sustained by stubbornness. The buildings along the main thoroughfare were weathered gray timber, their paint peeled away by the relentless sandstorms. Even the sun seemed sharper here, a white-hot coin that offered no warmth, only a scorching, blinding light that bleached the color out of the world. Luke Carver sat astride his bay gelding, a horse as rib-thin and weary as the land itself. Luke was a man of 32 years, though the sun had etched lines around his eyes that made him look older. He wore a hat that had once been black but was now the color of dust, and his canvas coat was patched at the elbows. He sat motionless on a ridge overlooking the northern pasture of his ranch, a tin cup of coffee resting against his thigh. The coffee was lukewarm and bitter, boiled too long over a fire made of dried dung and sage twigs, but he drank it anyway to cut the dust in his throat. He looked out over the herd. 2 years ago, the cattle had numbered nearly 500 head. Now, after 24 months of drought and a winter so brutal the old-timers still spoke of it in hushed tones, he was down to fewer than 200. The winter had been a white death. The snow had fallen for 6 days straight, drifting 10 feet high against the barn walls. When the thaw finally came, it revealed carcasses scattered across the range like stones, stiff and frozen. Luke had spent weeks dragging them into piles to burn, a task that had hardened something inside his chest. He nudged the horse forward, descending the rocky slope to check a section of fence line. The wind had been at it again, snapping a cedar post as if it were a dry twig. Luke dismounted, his boots crunching on the gravel. He worked with practiced, efficient movements, his hands calloused and scarred from years of wire and wood. He did not have the money for new wire, so he spliced the old rusted strand, twisting the metal until it held. It was not just the elements Luke was fighting. It was the arithmetic of debt. He owed $800 to the bank in town, a sum that might as well have been $1 million. The note was held by Amos McKinnon, a man who owned the bank, the largest general store, and the best water rights in the county. McKinnon was a man of soft hands and hard eyes, a predator who did not hunt with a gun, but with a ledger. He had made it clear to Luke the last time they spoke that patience was a currency, and Luke's account was overdrawn. Luke finished the fence and wiped his forehead with the back of his glove. He mounted up and turned toward the distant cluster of buildings that marked the town. He had to go in for supplies, specifically flour and coffee, though he hated spending the coin. As he rode into Silver Mesa, the town was busy with the midday trade. Wagons rattled over the rutted dirt, and men shouted from the boardwalks. Luke kept his head down, the brim of his hat shading his eyes. He tied his horse outside the mercantile and walked toward the post office, his spurs chiming softly in the dust. Across the street, through the large glass window of the dressmaker's shop, he saw her, Eliza Ward. Everyone in town knew Eliza, though few had ever exchanged more than 3 words with her. She was small, with a frame that looked as though a strong gust might carry her away into the sagebrush. She stood on a stool, pinning the hem of a calico dress on a banker's wife who was talking animatedly. Eliza did not speak. Her movements were precise, economic, and fluid. She held pins in her mouth, taking them out one by one to secure the fabric. Her hair was pulled back in a severe, tight bun, revealing a neck that looked impossibly fragile. From where Luke stood, she looked like a shadow. She never looked out the window. She never looked at the other women in the shop. She kept her eyes on the work. her expression completely unreadable. It was not a look of concentration, but rather a look of profound absence, as if she had retreated so deep inside herself that the world could no longer touch her. Luke watched her for a moment longer than he intended. He had heard the talk. In a town like Silver Mesa, gossip was the only form of entertainment that cost nothing, and the townspeople spent it freely. They said she had bad blood. They whispered that she was cursed. Her history was a patchwork of rumors stitched together by idle tongues. Her mother had been a woman of loose morals, a dancer at the Double Eagle Saloon on the edge of town, a place respectable folks did not go. 5 years ago, a fire had consumed the small shack where Eliza and her family lived. It had been a dry, windy night, much like this one. The fire had burned hot and fast. Eliza's mother and her younger sister, a child of only 6, had perished in the flames. Eliza had been found outside, singed and choking, staring at the inferno with wide, shock-blank eyes. Since then, the stories had twisted. Some said Eliza had knocked over the lamp in a fit of rage. Others said she had stood by and watched it burn without screaming for help. They called her a witch, a jinx, a bringer of misfortune. Men in the saloons made crude jokes about her, speculating on whether the daughter of a saloon girl had inherited her mother's talents, while the church women pulled their skirts aside when she passed, fearing that her bad luck was contagious. Luke turned away from the window, feeling a sour taste in his mouth. He had no patience for gossip, having been the subject of enough of it himself when his own father died and left him with a mortgaged ranch and a half-wild herd. But he also had no room in his life for someone else's tragedy. He had his own ghosts to contend with. Later that evening, the sun began to dip below the western horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of bruised purple and blood orange. Eliza Ward left the dressmaker's shop through the back door. She clutched a worn gray shawl tightly around her shoulders, her knuckles white against the wool. She walked along the dirt road that led to the small boarding house room she rented on the outskirts of town. The wind picked up, whipping her skirts around her ankles. She walked with her head down, counting her steps, eyes fixed on the dirt. A group of boys, aged 10 or 12, were playing near the blacksmith's shed. When they saw her, the game stopped. "There goes the fire starter." One of them shouted, "Witch!" Another yelled. A small stone skittered across the dirt and struck the toe of her boot. Another flew past her ear, missing her by inches. Eliza did not flinch. She did not stop. She did not look up or shout at them to leave her alone. She simply stepped to the side, avoiding the next stone with a fluid, practiced motion, and kept walking. She had learned long ago that reaction was fuel. If she gave them nothing, no tears, no anger, no fear, eventually they would get bored. She was a ghost walking through a world of living, angry things. She reached the safety of the boarding house porch and slipped inside, the heavy door shutting out the jeers of the children and the howling of the wind. At the same hour, in the warm, lamplit study of the parsonage, Pastor Green sat opposite Amos McKinnon. The contrast between the two men was stark. Pastor Green was a thin, anxious man with a fraying collar and a genuine, if rigid, desire to impose order on a chaotic world. Amos McKinnon was broad, dressed in a tailored suit of dark wool, holding a crystal tumbler of whiskey which he swirled gently. The pastor looked distressed. "The moral fiber of this town is fraying." "Amos," Green said, wringing his hands, "there is too much drinking, too much idleness, and the rumors about that Ward girl are becoming poisonous. I hear talk of people wanting to run her out of town. If something happens to her, the blood will be on our hands." Amos took a slow sip of his whiskey. He did not care about the moral fiber of the town, nor did he care about Eliza Ward's safety. He cared about assets. And right now, he had two problems that could be solved with one stroke. "She is a disruption," Amos agreed, his voice smooth and deep like gravel shifting in a riverbed. "A single woman with her reputation is a lightning rod for trouble. She needs a situation, a home, respectability." Green nodded vigorously. "Exactly, but who would take her? The men in this town treat her like a pariah." Amos set his glass down. "Not all men. We need a man who is desperate. A man who needs stability as much as she does. A man who can be leveraged. Green looked confused. Who do you mean? Luke Carver, Amos said. Carver? Green frowned. He is struggling. I spoke to him last Sunday. He looked like a man at the end of his rope. He is, Amos said. He owes the bank $800. He cannot pay. I am preparing the foreclosure papers this week. The ranch will be mine before the first snow. That is terrible, Green said softly. His father was a good man. Amos leaned forward, his eyes cold and sharp. It is business, Pastor, but perhaps there is a mercy to be found here. If Carver were to marry, he would be viewed as a stable family man. The bank looks favorably on such things. If he were to take Eliza Ward off the town's conscience, I might be inclined to restructure his debt, extend the term, lower the interest, give him a fighting chance. Green considered this. He saw a chance to save a woman's reputation and a man's inheritance. He saw a way to bring two lost sheep into the fold of domestic order. It is a Christian thought. Amos, to bind them together. It solves your problem with the girl, Amos said, standing up and buttoning his coat. And it secures the ranch. You speak to Carver. Use your authority. I will handle the financial incentives. But will they agree? Green asked. Amos smiled, a thin, humorless curving of his lips. They have no choice. Pastor, that is the beauty of it. 2 days later, Luke Carver stood in the pastor's modest parlor, turning his hat over and over in his hands. The room smelled of beeswax and old paper. He felt too large for the space, his boots stained with the dust of the trail, his presence dark and imposing against the doilies and china plates. Pastor Green sat in his armchair, looking grave. Amos McKinnon stood by the fireplace, warming his hands, his back to the room. I do not understand, Luke said, his voice rough with frustration. You called me here to talk about my soul, and now you are telling me to take a wife. It is for your own good. Luke, Pastor Green said gently. A man alone on the range hardens. He loses his way, and the town looks at a bachelor with suspicion, especially one in financial trouble. I do not care how the town looks at me, Luke snapped. You should, Amos said, turning around. Luke stiffened. The presence of the banker made the air in the room feel thin. Amos walked over and stood before Luke. I hold the note on your land. Carver, by rights. I should have foreclosed last month. You are 2 payments behind. I will have the money after the autumn roundup, Luke said, though he knew it was a lie. The cattle were too thin to fetch a good price. Amos shook his head. Too little, too late. However, the pastor and I have discussed a way to help you. The community needs stability. We have a young woman, Eliza Ward, who needs a home, a husband. Luke laughed, a harsh, barking sound. You want me to marry the fire girl, the mute? You must be mad. She is a hard worker. Green interjected quickly. She is quiet. Yes, but she is skilled with a needle, and she is strong. She needs protection. Luke, Scripture tells us to care for the vulnerable. I need a wife like I need a hole in my head, Luke said, his pride flaring hot in his chest. I can barely feed myself. I am not bringing a stranger into my house, especially one who won't even speak. Then you leave me no choice, Amos said, his voice dropping to a low, flat register. If you walk out of this house without agreeing to this arrangement, I will file the papers tomorrow morning. You will be off that ranch by sunset. Everything your father built, every fence post, every acre, will be gone. Luke stared at the banker, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. He wanted to swing. He wanted to break the smug look on Amos's face, but beneath the anger, a cold, sickening fear took root. The ranch was all he had. It was the only thing his father, Samuel, had left him. Samuel had built that house with his own hands, dragging logs down from the timberline. To lose it would be to erase his father's existence. It is blackmail, Luke said through gritted teeth. It is a lifeline, Amos corrected. You marry the girl. You give her a respectable name. In exchange, I freeze the interest on your loan for 2 years and extend the principal repayment by 5. You keep the ranch. Luke looked at the pastor. Green looked down at his hands. Think of your father's legacy. Green whispered. Luke felt the trap snap shut. He was cornered, backed against a wall by drought, by debt, and now by these men. He took a deep breath, the air whistling through his nose. Fine. Luke spat the word out. Fine. While Luke was being cornered in the parsonage, Eliza was facing her own tribunal. She sat on a wooden crate in the back room of the dress shop. The air was thick with the smell of fabric dye and starch. Mrs. Gable, the shop owner, stood with her arms crossed, looking severe. Pastor Green had come straight to the shop after Luke had left. Eliza sat with her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on a knot in the floorboards. "It is settled," Pastor Green said, his voice booming in the small space. "Mr. Carver has agreed. It is a fine match. Eliza, he is a rancher. He has land. You will be mistress of a home." Eliza felt a tremor run through her fingers. She clamped her hands together tighter. Marriage. The word felt like a sentence, not a promise. She remembered her mother's distinct, terrified voice shouting at men. She remembered the smell of stale whiskey and the sound of heavy boots. Men were dangerous. Men took what they wanted and left wreckage behind. And Luke Carver? She had seen him riding through town. He was big, dark, unsmiling. A hard man. "You cannot stay here forever." "Eliza." "Mrs." Gable said, her voice sharp. "People are talking." "I have lost 2 customers this month just because you work here. They say you bring bad luck. I cannot afford to keep you on if this continues." Eliza looked up, her eyes wide. This job was her only survival. Without it, she would starve. Pastor Green stepped closer. "If you do not accept this marriage, the town will not be kind to you. We can only protect you so far. But as a married woman, as Mrs. Carver, you will have standing. You will be safe. Safe." The word hung in the air. Eliza wanted to laugh, but she had forgotten how. Nowhere was safe. The fire had taught her that. Safety was an illusion. She opened her mouth. Her throat felt dry, like the desert wind. She forced the words out, her voice barely a whisper. "Rusty from disuse. Is he cruel?" It was the only thing that mattered. She could handle hard work. She could handle poverty. She could not handle cruelty. Pastor Green looked relieved that she had spoken. "No, child, no. He is a hard man, yes. He has seen difficult times, but he is honest. He is not a drinker. He is not cruel." Eliza looked at Mrs. Gable, who nodded impatiently. Eliza felt the old, familiar sensation of her life slipping out of her hands. It had never really been hers. It had belonged to her mother, then to the fire, then to the town's judgment. Now it would belong to Luke Carver. She looked down at her hands again. There was no choice. There never was. She nodded once, a sharp, jerky motion. "Good, Mrs." Gable said, clapping her hands. "The wedding will be tomorrow morning. Best to get it done before anyone changes their mind." The morning of the wedding was cold. A hard frost had settled overnight, coating the sagebrush in silver. The sun rose in a pale, washed-out sky, offering light but no heat. The wind was already up, snapping the white muslin curtains of the small church, making them crack like whips. Dust swirled on the wooden steps, dancing in little devils that rose and fell with the gusts. The church was empty, save for the witnesses. Amos McKinnon sat in the front pew, looking bored, checking his pocket watch. Mrs. Gable stood on the other side, looking eager to be done with it. Luke stood at the altar. He had brushed his coat and polished his boots, but he still looked like a man preparing for a fight rather than a sacrament. His jaw was set so tight a muscle ticked in his cheek. He stared straight ahead at the plain wooden cross, refusing to look at the door. Then, the door opened. Eliza walked in. She wore her best dress, a simple gray wool that she had made herself. It was neat and clean, but entirely plain. She had no veil, no flowers. She walked down the aisle with short, hesitant steps, her eyes fixed on the floor. When she reached the altar, she stopped and stood beside him. They were close enough to touch, yet a chasm lay between them. "Dearly beloved," Pastor Green began, his voice fighting against the sound of the wind rattling the window panes. Luke turned his head slightly to look at her. It was the first time he had seen her this close. He noticed her hands first. They were clasped in front of her, the knuckles white, trembling with a fine, uncontrollable vibration like a trapped bird. He looked at her face. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and there were bruising purple shadows beneath her eyes, as if she had not slept in days. She looked terrified. Something in Luke's chest tightened. He had expected a sullen, strange woman. He had not expected someone who looked like she was waiting to be struck. Eliza felt his gaze. She forced herself to look up. She had to know the face of the man who now owned her life. She saw a face weathered by sun and wind. There was a scar running along his jawline, a jagged white line from some old fight or accident. His eyes were dark, shadowed by his brow. He looked tired, deeply, deeply tired. But as their eyes met, she saw something else. It was not the sneer of the boys who threw stones. It was not the cold calculation of Amos McKinnon. It was a guardedness, yes, but behind it, a flicker of something that might have been kindness, or perhaps just pity. "Do you, Luke Carver, take this woman?" Pastor Green intoned. Luke hesitated for a fraction of a second. The weight of the debt, the ranch, the trap he was in pressed down on him. Then he looked at Eliza's trembling hands. "I do," he said. His voice was low, rough like sandstone. "And do you? Eliza Ward." Eliza's heart hammered against her ribs. She took a breath. "I do." The words were barely audible, a wisp of sound that the wind nearly stole away. But in that moment, she looked at him again. Her eyes met his, a sharp, quick glance. For a second, the contact was electric, a spark in dry grass. It was intense, searching, and painfully raw. Then, just as quickly, she looked away, her lashes lowering against her cheeks. Luke felt a jolt in his chest, a physical thud that had nothing to do with the debt or the ranch. He blinked, startled by the intensity of the small, silent woman beside him. "I now pronounce you man and wife," Green said. There was no kiss. Neither of them moved to close the distance. They signed the register in silence. Amos McKinnon nodded to Luke as they walked out, a smug, satisfied tilt of his head that made Luke's blood boil. Outside, Luke's wagon was waiting. The horses stamped their feet, eager to be moving. Luke climbed up and reached a hand down to help her. Eliza hesitated, staring at his large, gloved hand. Then she reached up. Her fingers were cold through the wool of her shawl. Luke gripped her hand firmly, not rough, but solid, and pulled her up onto the bench seat. He snapped the reins. "Hya!" The horses lurched forward. The wagon rattled out of Silver Mesa, leaving the church and the town behind. They rode in silence. The land stretched out before them. Miles of brown grass, gray rock, and gold dust, rolling on forever under the relentless, howling wind. Luke looked at the horizon, and Eliza looked at her hands. Two strangers bound together, driving into the teeth of the coming winter. The wagon rattled over the final rise, the wheels grinding against loose shale and dry earth. Ahead, the Carver ranch sprawled out in a valley that looked as though it had been scoured clean by a giant, abrasive hand. The house sat low against the ground, a single-story structure of weathered timber that had once been whitewashed but now showed the gray, splintered grain of the wood beneath peeling flakes of paint. The porch sagged perceptibly on the left side, the support posts leaning as if tired of holding up the roof against the weight of 20 winters. To the west, the barn leaned in sympathy with the house, its roof missing shingles, looking like a gap-toothed mouth gaping at the sky. Surrounding it all was the restless ocean of the grasslands, brown and brittle, stretching out toward hills that had been stripped bare by the wind until they looked like the knuckles of a clenched fist. Luke pulled back on the reins, bringing the horses to a halt near the porch. The silence that followed the cessation of the wagon wheels was heavy. It was not a peaceful silence, but a waiting one, filled only by the hiss of the wind through the dead grass and the creak of the wagon springs as the horses shifted their weight. Luke climbed down, his boots thudding into the dust. He walked around to the passenger side, feeling a strange tightness in his chest. He was bringing a woman here, a wife, to this place that barely supported him alone. He reached up, offering his hand. Eliza looked at the house. She took it in with a slow, sweeping gaze. The disrepair, the isolation, the sheer barrenness of it. It was a place that was fighting to die, held together only by the stubborn will of the man standing beside the wagon. She placed her hand in his and stepped down. Her boots touched the earth, and she nearly stumbled from the stiffness of the long ride. But Luke's grip held her steady. He released her hand quickly, as if her touch burned him. "Welcome home," Luke said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. It was not much of a welcome, and it was barely a home. Eliza nodded. She did not speak. She gathered her shawl tighter around her shoulders and walked toward the porch steps. One of the boards groaned under her weight. A dry, protesting sound. Luke winced. He had meant to fix that step 3 months ago. He pushed the front door open, the hinges squealing in the dry air. He stepped aside to let her pass. Eliza stepped across the threshold into the dim interior. The air inside was stale and smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and dust. It was a bachelor's house, functional and devoid of comfort. A heavy oak table dominated the center of the room, covered in a layer of grit that had sifted in through the cracks in the walls. A cast-iron stove sat cold in the corner. There was a single narrow bed pushed against the far wall, covered with a rough wool blanket. She stood in the center of the room, her hands clutching the small bundle of belongings she had brought from the boarding house. She looked at the dust on the table. She looked at the unwashed coffee cup sitting on the mantel. She looked at the chaotic pile of harness leather in the corner. Without a word, she set her bundle down on a chair. She took off her shawl and folded it neatly. Then, she walked to the table and ran a finger through the dust. It was an instinctive movement, a need to impose some small measure of order on a world that felt vast and uncontrollable. If she could clean the table, perhaps the rest of the chaos would stay at bay. Luke stood in the doorway, watching her. He felt a sudden, hot flush of shame. He saw the room through her eyes, the poverty, the neglect. "It is not much," Luke said, his voice booming too loud in the small space. He cleared his throat and tried to lower his volume. "I have been busy with the herd. Housekeeping falls behind." Eliza turned to him. Her face was blank, but her eyes were taking in everything. She nodded again, a small, sharp dip of her chin. "The water pump is out back," Luke said, gesturing vaguely toward the kitchen door. "The pantry is through there. It is not well stocked. Flour, beans, some salt pork. I need to go into town for more soon." He walked over to a small basin stand near the window. "And this is the wash basin. The mirror is cracked, but it works." He shoved his hands deep into his pockets, rocking back on his heels. He did not know what to do with himself. Usually, he would come in, throw his coat on the chair, and pour a drink. Now, he felt like a guest in his own skin. "I will. I have to check the horses," Luke stammered. He turned and fled the house, the door banging shut behind him. Eliza stood alone in the silence, the sound of the wind pressing against the walls. She let out a long, shaky breath that she had been holding since the church. She looked at the broom standing in the corner. She walked over, picked it up, and began to sweep. That evening, the sun went down in a blaze of red that made the horizon look like a wound. Inside the house, Luke had lit the kerosene lamp on the table. The golden light pushed back the shadows but seemed to make the silence thicker. They sat across from each other at the wooden table. Eliza had found the beans and the pork, and she had managed to heat them into a stew that tasted far better than anything Luke had cooked for himself in years. She ate with small, precise movements, her eyes fixed on her plate. The only sounds were the metallic clink of spoons against tin plates and the mournful, high-pitched keening of the wind as it searched for cracks in the siding. Every time the wind gusted, the flame in the lantern flickered, sending shadows dancing across Eliza's face. Luke watched her surreptitiously. She was so small. She took up almost no space at the table, almost no space in the room. Yet her presence was overwhelming. He was acutely aware of her breathing, of the way her hand moved to tuck a stray lock of hair behind her ear, of the scent of lavender soap that clung to her skin, a sharp contrast to the smell of dust and cattle that usually permeated the house. He wanted to say something. He wanted to ask her if the food was enough, if she was cold, if she regretted saying yes to the pastor. But the words felt heavy and clumsy in his mind. So he said nothing. When the meal was finished, Eliza stood immediately to clear the plates. "Leave them," Luke said. Eliza froze, looking at him with wide, startled eyes. Luke softened his tone. "You cooked. I will wash." She hesitated, looking at the plates, then at him. She seemed unsure of how to process the offer. After a moment, she stepped back and nodded. Luke stood and gathered the dishes. He took them to the basin and began to scrub. The domesticity of it felt strange, alien. When he turned back, Eliza was standing by the narrow bed, looking at it with an unreadable expression. "There is only one bed," Luke said. The awkwardness returned, crashing over him like a wave. Eliza looked at the floor, her shoulders hunching slightly. "You take it," Luke said firmly. "I have slept on the ground more nights than I have slept in a bed. A blanket by the stove will suit me fine." Eliza looked up, her mouth opening slightly as if to protest. She made a small negation gesture with her hand. "I insist," Luke said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I am not going to make you sleep on the floor." "Eliza," she looked at him for a long moment, searching for the cruelty she had been warned about, the hardness she expected. She found only a stubborn, weary courtesy. She nodded and turned to the bed. Luke took a spare blanket and a saddle blanket from the corner pile. He blew out the lamp, plunging the room into darkness save for the dull red glow of the embers in the stove. He lay down on the hard wooden floor, rolling the coat under his head for a pillow. He lay there for a long time, staring up at the invisible ceiling beams. His back ached, and the floor was unforgiving. Resentment simmered in his gut. He was a grown man, a rancher, sleeping on the floor of his own house because a banker and a preacher had cornered him. He was married to a stranger, a woman who looked at him as if he might strike her. But then, the sound of the wind died down for a moment, and he heard it, the soft, rhythmic sound of her breathing from the bed. It was a human sound in a lonely house. Sometime deep in the night, the rhythm changed. Luke woke from a light doze. The breathing had become jagged, fast. He lifted his head. Eliza was making small, distressed noises in her throat, a whimpering sound, like a trapped animal. "Please," she whispered in the dark. "Run! You have to run!" Luke sat up. The moonlight coming through the window cast a pale rectangle across the bed. Eliza was thrashing, her hands clawing at the blankets. "Hot!" she gasped. "It is too hot." Luke froze. He knew the stories. The fire, the mother. He felt a sudden, strange urge to go to her, to wake her, to shake her out of the memory. It was a protective instinct, sharp and surprising. He started to rise, his boots scraping on the floor. At the sound, Eliza gasped. She sat bolt upright, her chest heaving. She did not scream. She bit her lip so hard he could almost feel the pain of it. She sat there in the dark, trembling violently, fighting to choke back the cry that wanted to escape. She looked around wildly, her eyes landing on Luke's silhouette by the stove. She went completely still. She held her breath, terrified that she had woken him, terrified of his anger. Luke stayed where he was. He realized that going to her now would only frighten her more. He lay back down slowly, making a deliberate show of settling in, feigning sleep. He listened as her breathing slowly, painfully evened out. He lay awake for the rest of the night, listening to the wind and the silence of the woman who carried a fire in her head. Over the next 10 days, a routine formed. It was a quiet, fragile ecosystem. Eliza rose before the sun. Luke would wake to the smell of coffee and the sound of the stove door clicking shut. By the time he came in from the morning chores, there was bread on the table. Simple, dense loaves that filled his belly better than the hardtack he was used to. She moved through the house like a ghost. She fetched water from the pump, carrying the heavy buckets with stiff, careful steps, balancing the weight against her slight frame. She found his torn shirts, the ones he had thrown in a pile to be used as rags, and mended them. Her stitches were tiny and precise, the work of a professional seamstress. She repaired the worn leather straps of his saddlebags, oiling the leather until it was supple again. She never asked for anything. She never complained. She simply worked, leaving everything she touched better than she found it. Luke watched her from a distance. He would pause while shoeing a horse or fixing a gate to watch her hanging laundry on the line. He noticed how her hands were always busy, how she seemed to anticipate what needed doing before he even noticed it himself. But he also noticed the fear. One evening, he dropped a heavy wrench on the floorboards. The clang was sudden and loud. Eliza, who was kneading dough at the table, flinched so hard she nearly knocked the bowl over. She spun around, her eyes wide with panic, her hands raised as if to ward off a blow. Luke stood still, holding his hands up, palms open. "It is just a wrench. Eliza, just a wrench." She lowered her hands slowly, her face flushing with embarrassment. She turned back to the dough, attacking it with renewed vigor. He noticed, too, how she treated the fire. When she cooked, she stood as far back from the stove as she could. She used a long iron poker to adjust the wood, her body tense, her eyes locked on the flames with a mixture of hatred and respect. She never sat near the hearth in the evening. She always sat in the chair furthest from the heat, deep in the shadows. In town, the marriage was the only topic of conversation. When Luke rode in to buy the flour and nails he needed, the silence on the boardwalk was palpable. Men stopped talking as he passed. Women whispered behind their hands. He lowered himself. "Mrs." Gable sniffed to a customer in the mercantile. "Marrying that Ward girl. It is desperate. That is what it is. She must have bewitched him." The customer replied, "Tragedy follows her. You watch. That ranch will burn down or the cattle will die. She is a bad omen." Luke heard the murmurs. He kept his jaw locked tight, his eyes forward. He bought his supplies and left, the back of his neck prickling with the weight of their judgment. A few days later, Reed, an old friend of Luke's who ran a small spread to the south, rode out to the ranch. Reed was a good man, but he had a loud laugh and a mouth that often engaged before his brain did. He found Luke in the barn, pitching hay. "So, it is true," Reed bellowed. "Dismounting, the hermit has taken a wife." Luke leaned on the pitchfork. "Hello, Reed." Reed grinned, leaning against a stall door. "And the quietest one in the territory. No less. I saw her on the porch." "Does she speak, Luke, or do you just use sign language?" "She speaks when she has something to say," Luke said, his voice cool. Reed chuckled, slapping his thigh. "Well, that is a blessing, I suppose. Most women talk a man's ear off. But tell me, Luke," he lowered his voice, a lewd twinkle in his eye, "does she know how to kiss? Or does she just stand there like a statue?" Luke felt a flash of irritation that surprised him. It was a sharp, defensive spike in his gut. He thought of Eliza's trembling hands, the shadows under her eyes, the way she mended his shirts. "That is enough." "Reed," Luke said. Reed blinked, surprised by the tone. "I'm just joking. Luke, no offense intended." Luke turned back to the hay. "Just leave it be." Reed stayed for coffee, but the visit was awkward. When he left, his question lingered in Luke's mind. Does she know how to kiss? Luke had not touched her since he helped her down from the wagon. They lived in the same small house, breathed the same air, but they were miles apart. He found himself watching her mouth that evening as she ate, wondering about the woman hidden behind the wall of silence. The weather turned a week later. It began in the morning with a strange stillness, the air turning heavy and yellow. By noon, the sky was a bruised, sickly brown. The wind did not come in gusts. It came as a solid, roaring wall. "Dust storm!" Luke shouted as he burst through the door. Eliza looked up from her sewing. "Get the shutters," Luke yelled over the rising howl. "Then fill every bucket and pot with the water. I have to get the calves into the lee of the barn." He ran back out. Eliza sprang into action. She moved with a speed he had not seen before. She latched the heavy wooden shutters, the wind fighting her, slamming the wood against the siding. She pumped water furiously, filling the basin, the pot, the kettle, knowing that the dust would choke the pump if the storm was bad enough. Outside, the world was disappearing. The dust was not just in the air, it was the air. It stung the skin like needles and coated the teeth. Visibility dropped to 10 feet. Luke was on his horse, shouting, trying to drive the 30 confused calves toward the barn. The wind roared like a freight train. He saw a figure emerge from the house. "Eliza, go back inside," he screamed. She did not listen. She had a scarf tied around her face, her skirts whipping violently around her legs. She ran toward the corral gate, which was banging loose in the wind, threatening to tear off its hinges and let the horses escape. She grabbed the heavy wood, struggling to pull it shut against the gale. The wind caught it, turning it into a sail. It slammed back, knocking her to her knees. She scrambled up, grabbing it again. Luke spurred his horse, jumping off before the animal had fully stopped. He ran to her. The gate swung inward with the force of the wind, aiming straight for her. "Look out!" Luke lunged. He grabbed Eliza by the waist and yanked her back. The heavy timber of the gate slammed into the post where she had been standing a split second before with a crack that sounded like a gunshot. Luke stumbled back with the momentum, pulling her with him. He pinned her against the side of the barn to shield her from the flying grit. For a heartbeat, the world stopped. The wind howled, the dust swirled, but in the small space between them, there was a sudden, shocking stillness. Luke's hands were gripping her waist tightly. His body was pressed against hers, hard and unyielding. He could feel the rapid rise and fall of her chest against his own. His face was inches from hers. He looked down into her eyes. They were wide, the pupils blown, framed by lashes coated in golden dust. Her cheeks were flushed from the exertion and the wind. He felt the heat of her. She was not a ghost. She was solid, warm, alive. The scent of her, lavender and rain, cut through the smell of dust. Eliza looked up at him. She felt the strength of his hands on her waist, the solid wall of his chest. For a moment, she did not move. She felt a strange, terrifying pull, a magnetism that made her want to lean in. Then, the fear kicked in, the memory of rough hands, of being trapped. She pulled back sharply, gasping. She scrambled out of his hold, her eyes darting away. "The latch!" she shouted, her voice thin in the wind. "I have to check the latch." She turned and ran toward the chicken coop, her head down against the storm. Luke stood there for a moment, his hands still raised, the ghost of her warmth burning his palms. His heart was thudding against his ribs, a heavy, rhythmic hammering that had nothing to do with the danger of the storm. Night fell, but the storm did not break. The house groaned under the assault. Dust sifted in through the cracks in the window frames, coating the floor in a fine, silty layer. They sat at the table. The only light came from the kerosene lantern, which Luke had turned low to conserve fuel. The wind rattled the door in its frame, a constant, aggressive shaking. Eliza sat with her hands clasped tight on the table. Every time the house creaked, she flinched. Her eyes kept darting to the lantern flame, then to the dark corners of the room. Luke watched her. He saw the terror radiating off her in waves. He reached out and took the handle of the lantern. Eliza stiffened. "I am not going to put it out," Luke said softly. He moved the lantern slightly closer to him, shielding the flame with his body so it wouldn't flicker in the drafts. "I will keep it safe. Eliza," he said, "it will not fall. I promise." Eliza looked at him. The shadows played across his scarred face. He looked solid, like a rock in a river. "Thank you," she whispered. Her voice was soft, hesitant, but there was a steel core to it that surprised him. "I do not like storms," she admitted, her gaze dropping to the table. "They make me remember bad times." She did not say fire. She did not have to. Luke nodded. "I know." He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking. "I am sorry about the gate today. I did not mean to grab you so rough. You saved me," Eliza said. "The gate would have broken my arm, or worse." There was a silence, but it was less heavy than before. The storm outside seemed to create a cocoon around them, forcing them into a shared space. "I am close to losing this place." "Eliza," Luke said suddenly. The confession hung in the air. He had not meant to say it. He had never said it aloud to anyone, not even Reed. "The drought took the herd," he continued, looking at his hands. "McKinnon owns the paper on the land. I hoped that this marriage would stop the gossip, that it would give me time." He looked up at her, his eyes honest. "I did not want a wife chosen for me. It hurt my pride. I was angry when I said yes." Eliza flinched, shrinking slightly in her chair. "But," Luke added quickly, leaning forward, "I do not blame you. I want you to know that you were backed into a corner just like I was. You are not a burden, Eliza. You work harder than any hand I have ever hired." Eliza listened, her heart pounding. He was speaking to her like an equal, not like a child, not like a curse. She raised her head. Her gaze was timid, but she held his eyes. "I never expected to be anyone's choice," she said quietly. The words were simple, but they cut Luke to the bone. "I have always been something to be hidden away," she continued, "or traded, or used to fix a problem. I did not expect this to be any different." Luke felt a surge of anger, not at her, but at the town, at the pastor, at the mother who had failed her, at the world that had made a young woman believe her only value lay in her invisibility. He studied her face in the flickering light. He saw the curve of her mouth, usually so tight, now softened by vulnerability. He saw eyes that held back entire storms of feeling, grief, fear, and a desperate, buried hope. "You are here now," Luke said, his voice rough with emotion. "You are not hidden." Eliza looked at him, her breath catching. For a moment, the distance between them, the bed and the floor, the silence and the secrets, felt bridgeable. The wind howled outside, shaking the walls, but inside, the air was still. "Go to sleep, Eliza," Luke said gently. "I will watch the fire." She nodded slowly. She stood up and walked to the bed. She lay down, pulling the quilt up to her chin. She watched him for a long time, his broad back hunched over the table, guarding the flame, before she finally closed her eyes. She did not have the nightmare that night. The weeks that followed brought a slow, subtle thaw. The snows had not yet come, but the air was biting cold. Small gestures began to bridge the gap between them. Luke started waking 10 minutes earlier. When Eliza came out of the bedroom, she would find the stove already stoked and a cup of coffee sitting on the table, steam rising from it. He never said anything about it, just drank his own coffee standing by the window. But Eliza would wrap her hands around the warm ceramic and feel a strange warmth spread through her chest. In return, Eliza began to pay attention to his gear. One afternoon, Luke came in to find his favorite canvas jacket, the one with the torn lining and the missing buttons, hanging on the back of his chair. It had been washed, the lining patched with sturdy gray wool, and the buttons replaced with new bone ones. He put it on. It fit perfectly. He looked at Eliza, who was busy scrubbing potatoes, her back to him. "Thank you," he said. She turned and offered a small, fleeting smile. It was the first time she had smiled at him. It transformed her face, making her look younger, softer. "You are welcome," she said. They still slept separately. Luke still took the floor, and Eliza took the bed. They still spoke rarely, but the silence had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was a shared space, comfortable and companionable. When they sat together in the evenings, Eliza mending and Luke cleaning his rifle or tallying the accounts, their knees would sometimes brush under the table. They didn't pull away immediately. Luke found himself watching her hands more often. Eliza found herself watching the way his shoulders moved when he chopped wood. The winter was coming, and with it, the threat of Amos McKinnon's deadline, but inside the weather-beaten house, a fragile, tentative heat was beginning to grow. A small flame held carefully against the dark. The spring came to the high plains not with a shout of green, but with a whimper of gray dust. The calendar said it was April, but the land told a different story. The earth remained stubbornly hard, locking away its moisture deep beneath a crust that rang like iron under a horse's hoof. The wind, which usually softened this time of year, kept its winter edge, stripping the topsoil from the fields and piling it in drifts against the base of the barn. Luke Carver sat on his horse, looking over the pen of 30 steers he had separated from the main herd. They were light. He could see the ridges of their ribs and the sharp angles of their hips. In a good year, he would have kept them on grass for another 2 months, fattening them up until their coats shone and their weight brought top dollar. But this was not a good year. It was a year of subtraction. He had to sell. The note at the bank was due, or at least the interest on it. And Amos McKinnon did not accept excuses in place of currency. Luke signaled to his dog, a black and white collie named Bess, and they began the slow, dusty drive into Silver Mesa. The cattle moved lethargically, heads low, their hooves kicking up a cloud that coated Luke's throat and settled in the creases of his neck. He felt a heavy, dull ache in his chest, the specific weight of a man who knows he is failing by inches. When he arrived in town, he took the cattle to the stockyards. The buyer, a man with a cigar clamped between his teeth, shook his head as he looked over the animals. He offered Luke a price that was an insult. Luke argued, his voice rising, but the buyer simply pointed to the drought-starved condition of the stock. In the end, Luke took the money. It was barely enough to cover the interest payment, with nothing left over for seed or flour. Luke walked to the bank, the bills folded tightly in his pocket. The interior of the bank was a different world from the street outside. It smelled of lemon oil, beeswax, and money. The air was cool and still, insulated from the wind by thick brick walls. Amos McKinnon sat behind a massive desk of polished mahogany, flanked by leather-bound ledgers that looked like tombstones. He did not stand when Luke entered. He simply gestured to the chair opposite him, a small smile playing on his lips. "You are short." "Carver," Amos said, after counting the bills Luke placed on the desk. "It is the interest," Luke said, his hat in his hands. "The principal will have to wait until the fall drive." Amos leaned back, steepled his fingers, and looked at Luke with the expression of a man studying a particularly interesting insect. "The fall drive," Amos repeated. "You are an optimist." "Luke, I admire that. But I look at the weather, and I look at your herd, and I do not see a fall drive. I see carcasses." Luke said nothing. He kept his jaw tight. Amos opened a drawer and pulled out a sheet of paper. "Perhaps it is time to be realistic. You are fighting a losing battle on that patch of dirt your father left you. It is good land, but it needs capital to work it properly. Capital you do not have." Amos slid the paper across the desk. "I am prepared to make you an offer," Amos said. "Sell me the deed. I will wipe the debt clean. And, because I am a generous man, I will hire you on as foreman for my northern spread. You know cattle. You are a hard worker. You would have a steady wage, a roof over your head, and none of this worry." Luke looked at the paper. It was a surrender. It was an invitation to become a servant on the land his father had bled to own. "I am not for sale, Amos," Luke said, his voice low and steady. "And neither is my ranch." Amos's expression hardened. The veneer of politeness vanished, revealing the cold iron beneath. "You are a fool," he said. "You are drowning, and I am offering you a rope. If you do not pay the full installment by the next quarter, I will not ask again. I will foreclose. I will take the house, the land, and whatever livestock is left standing. And you and that mute wife of yours will be on the street." Luke stood up. He placed his hat on his head and looked down at the banker. "You will get your money," Luke said, "but I will not work for you. Not now. Not ever." He turned and walked out, the sound of his boots heavy on the floorboards. The sun outside was blinding. Luke walked toward the general store, needing to buy a sack of cornmeal with the few coins he had kept back. As he passed the open windows of the church meeting hall, he heard voices. The Ladies' Aid Society was in session. He slowed his pace as he heard a name. "Eliza Ward," a sharp voice said. Or Eliza Carver, I suppose, though it hardly seems right. She was not in service again this Sunday. Another woman replied, Well, does she ever attend? The first voice asked. She hides in that house like a criminal. It is unnatural. They say tragedy follows her like a shadow. A third voice chimed in, lower but distinct. Her mother was the same. Bad blood does not wash out. Sisters, Luke Carver has brought a curse onto his land. That is why the rain does not fall. Luke stopped. His hands curled into fists at his sides, the leather of his gloves creaking. The anger that had been simmering since the bank flared white hot. He wanted to storm up the steps, kick open the doors, and shout at them. He wanted to tell them about the woman who mended his clothes until her fingers bled, who cooked his meals with nothing but beans and determination. But he could not fight a roomful of churchwomen. He could not punch a whisper. He swallowed the bile in his throat and kept walking, the words burning into his mind like a brand. Bad blood, curse, back at the ranch, the wind was relentless. Eliza was behind the house, kneeling in the dirt. She had turned over a small patch of earth near the kitchen door, using a spade that was too heavy for her. She was planting seeds, squash and beans that she had saved from the dried pods of last year. The soil was gray and powdery, crumbling between her fingers. It felt dead, but she pressed the seeds into the ground anyway, covering them with care. It was an act of defiance. If she could make something grow here, in this unforgiving place, perhaps she could belong here. She heard the wagon approaching and stood up, brushing the dirt from her apron. Her back ached, a dull throb at the base of her spine, but she ignored it. Luke climbed down from the wagon. He did not wave. He did not smile. He looked like a thunderhead that had touched the ground. He began unhitching the horses with jerky, violent movements. Eliza walked toward him, intending to help, but the look on his face stopped her. He was radiating tension. She stepped back, making herself small, and went into the house to start supper. The meal was an exercise in misery. The cornmeal mush was hot and filling, but Luke ate it as if he were chewing on gravel. The coffee is weak, he snapped, setting his cup down hard enough to splash liquid onto the table. Eliza flinched. I stretched the grounds, she whispered. We were low. Luke looked at her. He saw the way she hunched her shoulders, the way she kept her eyes on her plate. It was the posture of a dog expecting a kick. The image of Amos McKinnon's smug face and the sound of the women's gossip collided in his mind with his own sense of failure. He was taking it out on her. He knew it, and he hated himself for it, which only made him angrier. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. I am going out, he muttered. He grabbed his coat and stormed out the door, leaving Eliza sitting alone at the table with the cooling coffee and the silence. Luke walked until he reached the ridge that overlooked the western pasture. The moon was rising, a sliver of bone in the vast, dark sky. It washed the land in a pale, ghostly light, turning the sagebrush into silver skeletons and outlining the distant buttes in stark relief. He took a deep breath of the cold air, trying to cool the heat in his blood. He felt crushed. The land was against him. The town was against him. Even fate seemed to be laughing at him. He was one man trying to hold back a landslide with his bare hands. He heard a soft footstep behind him. He did not turn. He knew who it was. Eliza stood in the doorway for a long time before she followed him. Every instinct she had told her to stay inside, to be invisible, to let the man's anger burn itself out. That was how she had survived. But she had seen the look in his eyes before he left. It was not just anger. It was despair. She stepped up beside him. She did not touch him. She simply stood there, a small, dark figure against the vastness of the night. They stood in silence for a long time, listening to the wind hiss through the dry grass. When the fire happened, Eliza said softly, her voice barely carrying over the wind. Luke turned his head slightly to look at her. She was staring out at the horizon, her profile etched in moonlight. The town said it was God's judgment. She continued, because of who my mother was, because of where we lived. They said fire cleanses the wicked. She paused, her hands gripping her elbows as if she were cold. I almost believed them. Luke, for a long time, I thought I carried a spark inside me that burned everything I touched. I thought the land hated me. Luke turned fully toward her now. He had never heard her speak so many words at once. Why did you never say anything to them? Luke asked. To the people who said those things? Eliza looked down at her boots. Because speaking never changed anything. People hear what they want to hear. If I defended myself, they called me insolent. If I cried, they called me weak. Silence was the only thing that was mine. It was a wall I built so they could not see how much they hurt me. Her voice trembled on the last words, but she did not cry. She lifted her chin and looked back at the dark line of the horizon. Luke felt an ache in his throat. He looked at this woman, this quiet, terrified woman, and he saw a strength that shamed him. She had endured a hell he could barely imagine, and she was still standing. She was still planting seeds in the dust. He looked out at the land. During the war, Luke said it was his turn. He had not spoken of the war to anyone in 10 years. I rode with a unit that did hard things. We were in Missouri. It was not like the battles you read about in the papers. It was neighbor against neighbor. Ambushes, barn burning. He took a jagged breath. We came upon a farmhouse one night. We thought it was a supply depot for the Jayhawkers. It wasn't. It was just a family. A man and his sons. He stopped. He could still smell the smoke. He could still hear the shouting. I did things that night that I cannot undo. Eliza, when I came home, I thought I was damned. I thought I had no right to a life. I have tried to make this ranch into something decent, something clean, to balance the scales. He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred. But I think the scales are too heavy on one side, he whispered. Eliza turned to him. She reached out, her hand hovering for a moment before she lightly touched his sleeve. You are not that man anymore, she said. I do not know, Luke said. Sometimes I feel like he is still here, just waiting. He is not, she said firmly. That man would not have saved me from the gate. That man would not have given me his bed. They looked at each other in the moonlight. The distance that had defined their marriage, the polite, wary distance of strangers, was gone. In its place was the raw, jagged connection of two wounded people who had finally shown each other their scars. 3 days later, a new face appeared in Silver Mesa. Sheriff Cole was a tall man with eyes the color of slate and a mustache that was groomed with military precision. He had been hired by the town council, at the urging of Amos McKinnon, to maintain order as the territory grew. He wore a badge that gleamed even in the dust, and he carried a Colt Peacemaker low on his hip. He was not a loud man. He did not swagger. He stood on the boardwalks and watched. He noted who drank too much, who owed money, and who talked against the interests of the town's leading citizens. He was a professional, and his employer was the status quo. Luke met him on a Tuesday evening. Luke had ridden into town to pick up a part for the plow. He was tired, his muscles aching from wrestling with the broken machinery all day. He stopped at the Golden Steer Saloon for a single whiskey to cut the dust. The saloon was crowded. Smoke hung in the air like a blue fog. Luke stood at the end of the bar, nursing his drink, keeping to himself. At a table near the center of the room, a group of cowboys from the Double R Ranch were playing poker. They were loud, drunk, and looking for amusement. One of them, a man named Jeb with a gap-toothed grin and a mean streak, spotted Luke. "Hey, Carver!" Jeb shouted. Luke ignored him. "I heard you got hitched," Jeb continued, louder this time. "To the mute girl." The saloon went quiet. Men turned to watch. Jeb laughed, slamming his cards down. "I bet that is a quiet house. Or maybe she makes noise when it counts, eh? Like her mother did?" Luke stiffened. He set his glass down on the bar. Jeb stood up, swaying slightly. "My PA used to visit her mother, said she was the best ride in the territory. Guess the apple does not fall far from the whore's tree." The word hung in the air. Whore. Luke turned. He did not think. He did not calculate the consequences. The rage that he had swallowed outside the church. The shame he had felt at the bank. the protectiveness he felt for the woman planting seeds in the dirt. It all coalesced into a single point of motion. He crossed the distance in 2 strides. Jeb was still grinning when Luke's fist connected with his jaw. There was a sickening crunch. Jeb's head snapped back, and he went down like a sack of grain, crashing into the table and sending cards and whiskey flying. Jeb groaned, rolling on the floor, blood pouring from his mouth. Luke stood over him, his chest heaving, his fists still clenched. "Get up," he snarled. "Say it again. That is enough." The voice cut through the room like a whip crack. Sheriff Cole stepped through the batwing doors. He walked calmly into the center of the room, his hand resting casually on the butt of his gun. He looked at Jeb on the floor, then at Luke. "You have a heavy hand." "Mr. Carver," Cole said. "He insulted my wife," Luke said, his voice shaking with adrenaline. Cole nodded slowly. "Words are wind. Carver, broken jaws are a crime." He looked up toward the balcony that overlooked the saloon floor. Amos McKinnon was standing there, a cigar in his hand. He looked down at the scene with a look of quiet satisfaction. "We are trying to build a civilized town here," Cole said, turning back to Luke. "We cannot have brawling in the streets, especially not from a man who owes the bank as much as you do. It looks unstable." Luke followed Cole's gaze to Amos. He realized, with a sinking feeling, that he had walked right into a trap. "Go home." "Carver," Cole said, "and consider this a warning. If I have to speak to you again, you will sleep in a cell." Luke looked around the room. The eyes of the town were on him, judging, fearful, amused. He turned and walked out, the silence following him. News of the fight traveled faster than a telegraph. By the time Luke reached the ranch, the story had already mutated. Luke Carver had gone crazy. He had nearly killed a man. He was violent, just like his wife was cursed. Luke rode into the yard and swung down from his horse. Eliza was waiting on the porch. She had heard the news from a passing neighbor. Her face was pale. "Is it true?" she asked as he stomped up the steps. "Did you hit a man? He deserved it," Luke snapped, pushing past her into the house. Eliza followed him. "He called me a whore's daughter, didn't he?" Luke stopped. He turned to face her. "Yes, he did." Eliza's hands were shaking. "And for that, you risked everything." "Luke, the sheriff is Amos's man. They are looking for a reason to take you down. You cannot give them one." "I defended your name," Luke shouted. "Do you expect me to stand there and let them filth talk you? I expect you to be smart," Eliza cried out, her voice rising to a volume he had never heard before. "I have lived with insults my whole life. They are just words. But if you are in jail, who runs the ranch? Who pays the debt? We lose everything." "Luke, I have a name," Luke roared, slamming his hand on the table. "I have land. I have to protect it." Eliza stepped forward, her eyes blazing with tears. "And I have been a name with no protection at all," she shouted back. The room went deadly silent. Eliza stood there, breathing hard. "My whole life. Men have said what they wanted, done what they wanted. I had no father to punch them. I had no husband to challenge them. I learned to survive by making myself stone. And now you are going to throw away our only chance at a future because of your pride?" Luke stared at her. The words hit him like physical blows. He saw the years of fear and vulnerability behind her anger. He saw the little girl watching her house burn. He opened his mouth, but no words came. He felt ashamed. And because he felt ashamed, he felt defensive. He turned away. "I did it for you," he said, his voice low and bitter. He walked into the bedroom and slammed the door. The night was cold. The wind rattled the loose boards of the porch. A lonely, skeletal sound. Coyotes howled in the distance, yipping and crying at the moon. Eliza stood by the window in the main room. She had not lit the lamp. She stared out at the darkness, feeling the old, familiar pressure in her chest, the urge to run, to disappear, to just vanish into the sagebrush before she caused any more harm. Tragedy follows her. The women were right. He had been a quiet, hard-working man before she came. Now he was brawling in saloons. Now he was a target. She heard the bedroom door open. Luke walked out. He was in his stocking feet. He moved slowly across the floor until he was standing a few feet behind her. "Eliza," he said. She did not turn. Luke took a breath. "You were right." Eliza closed her eyes. "I let my anger drive the wagon," Luke said, his voice rough. "I should have been smarter. I should have protected you by keeping us safe, not by throwing punches." He stepped closer. "I am sorry." Eliza turned around. The moonlight coming through the window caught the wet tracks of tears on her cheeks. She looked at him, this big, scarred, stubborn man who was trying so hard to be good in a world that wanted him to be hard. She did not look away. For the first time, she did not drop her gaze. She stepped closer to him. She reached up, her fingers trembling slightly, and touched his cheek. Her thumb brushed over the jagged white line of the scar on his jaw. Luke went very still. The air between them seemed to charge with static electricity. He could smell the lavender soap on her skin. He could see the war in her eyes, fear fighting with defiance. "I am tired," Eliza whispered. Luke watched her, mesmerized. "Tired of what?" "I'm tired of being quiet," she said, her voice gaining a low, thrumming intensity. "I'm tired of hiding, and I'm tired of being treated like a burden that you have to carry." She looked deep into his eyes. "I want to choose. Luke, just once, I want to choose something for myself." Luke's breath hitched. "What do you choose?" Eliza did not answer with words. She lifted onto her toes. She grabbed the front of his shirt in her fists, pulling him down toward her. She kissed him. It was not a tentative, shy peck. It was a collision. It was years of bottled longing, years of silence, years of needing to be seen, all pouring out in a single moment. Her mouth moved against his with a fierce, searching intensity. It was desperate and hot and demanding. Luke was stunned. For a second, he stood frozen, his arms at his sides, his mind reeling. He had thought she was breakable. He had thought she was made of glass, but the woman kissing him was fire. He felt the solid floor drop away beneath him. All his careful restraint, all the nights sleeping on the hard floor, all the distance he had kept to make her feel safe, it was swept away like dust in a gale. He made a low sound in his throat. He brought his hands up and grabbed her waist, pulling her body hard against his. He kissed her back, matching her intensity. The world narrowed down to the heat of her mouth, the grip of her hands on his shirt, the rough catch of her breath against his cheek. He was overwhelmed. It was not just desire, though that was there, hot and urgent. It was the realization that he had been wrong about her. She was not the quietest woman in town. She was a storm, and she was choosing him. She was burning through every lie he had told himself about what he deserved. They clung to each other in the dark room, the wind howling outside, the coyotes crying, two people trying to merge into one to withstand the weight of the world. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard. Eliza's lips were swollen, her eyes wide and dark. Luke's hands were still gripping her waist, as if he was afraid she might vanish if he let go. There was a long, raw silence. There were no jokes, no pretty words. There was only the sound of their breathing and the shared, terrifying awareness that everything had changed. The wall was gone, and neither of them knew what would happen next, only that they would face it from the same side of the line. The air in the small, weather-beaten house had changed. It was no longer the stale, silent air of two strangers sharing a roof out of necessity. It was charged, heavy with a new kind of electricity that hummed beneath the floorboards and crackled in the spaces between them. In the days following that night, the night the wind had howled and Eliza had crossed the distance between them, Luke and Eliza moved around each other with a heightened, almost painful awareness. The memory of the kiss hung in the room like smoke. It was in the way Luke paused with his coffee cup halfway to his mouth when Eliza walked into the kitchen, the morning light catching the stray hairs escaping her braid. It was in the way Eliza's hand stilled over the bread dough when she felt Luke's gaze on her back, a physical weight she no longer wanted to shrug off. They did not speak of it directly. Words were still difficult terrain for them, full of potential pitfalls and old habits of silence. But the physical distance that had defined their marriage began to erode. not in a landslide, but grain by grain. During the evening chores, Eliza began sitting on the bench closer to where Luke cleaned his tack. She did not say anything, just mended socks or shelled beans, but her knees were inches from his boots. When Luke passed her the salt at dinner, his fingers lingered for a second longer than necessary against hers, rough skin against smooth, sending a jolt through them both that made the simple act of eating feel intimate. One evening, while Luke was struggling to rivet a broken harness strap, his hands cramping from the cold, Eliza quietly set down her sewing. She moved to stand beside him. Without asking, she placed her fingers over the leather, holding it steady so he could drive the rivet home. "Thank you," Luke murmured, his voice low. Eliza did not pull away when the task was done. She left her hand on the workbench, close enough that the warmth of his arm radiated against her shoulder. They stood there for a long moment, the smell of oiled leather and wood smoke wrapping around them, forehead almost touching forehead, communicating in the only language they both fully understood: presence. But while the atmosphere inside the house softened, the world outside grew harder and colder. Amos McKinnon was not a man who engaged in idle threats. He was a man of ledgers and laws, but he was also a man of immense pride. Luke's refusal to sell, followed by the public brawl in the saloon, had bruised Amos's ego. He looked at the Carver Ranch and saw not just a failing business, but a symbol of defiance that needed to be crushed. Amos began to pull strings. He did not do it loudly. He did it with whispered words over glasses of brandy in the back rooms of the town's establishments. "He is unstable," Amos told the owner of the feed store. "You saw him at the saloon, violent, unpredictable, and that woman." He would let the sentence hang, allowing the other man's prejudices to fill in the blank. Rumors began to swirl through Silver Mesa like dust devils. They said Luke was losing his mind. They said Eliza had worked some kind of dark spell on him, that her silence was not shyness, but something more sinister, a communion with spirits that did not belong in a Christian home. Pastor Green heard the whispers. He heard them in the sewing circle and in the vestibule after Sunday service. He saw the way people crossed the street to avoid the dress shop when Eliza was working. Guilt began to gnaw at him. He had orchestrated this union to save Eliza's reputation and Luke's soul, but it seemed he had only pinned a target on their backs. He spent long hours in prayer, asking if he had done the Lord's work or simply Amos McKinnon's bidding. Sheriff Cole, meanwhile, watched. He sat on the porch of the jailhouse, tipping his chair back, his eyes scanning the street. He had received his instructions. "Keep a close eye on Carver," Amos had said, sliding a fresh box of cigars across his desk. "A man that desperate is bound to make a mistake, and when he does, I want you there to catch it." Nature, indifferent to the machinations of men, dealt the next blow. It was late September, typically a time of golden light and cooling winds. But one night, the temperature plummeted, the wind died, and a deadly, silent cold settled over the valley. It was a black frost, the kind that kills without leaving a trace of white. Luke woke before dawn, sensing the change in the air. It was too quiet. He dressed hurriedly and went outside. The water in the horse trough was frozen solid. The ground was hard as iron. He ran to the calving pen. The 3 late-season calves, already weak from the poor grazing, were huddled together. One of them was down, its breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. Its ears were frozen. Luke cursed, a harsh sound in the brittle air. He worked for hours, rubbing life back into the animals, wrapping them in burlap, forcing warm mash down their throats. He managed to save 2, but the third died before the sun cleared the horizon. When he finally walked back toward the house, defeated and exhausted, he saw Eliza. She was kneeling in the garden plot behind the kitchen. This small patch of earth had been her victory. She had coaxed green shoots of squash and hardy beans from the reluctant soil, watering them by hand, shielding them from the wind with her own body. Now, they were black. The frost had snapped the stems and turned the leaves to slime. Every single plant was dead. Eliza was kneeling in the dirt, her hands resting on the ruined plants. She was not crying. She was staring at the ground with a look of utter devastation. It was not just about the food. It was the rejection. No matter how hard she worked, no matter how much she cared, the earth took and took. It felt personal. It felt like the land itself was rejecting her, just as the town had. She felt something inside her crack. A fragile strut that had been holding up her resolve gave way. Luke stopped. He saw the slump of her shoulders. He saw the dirt under her fingernails where she had tried, futilely, to brush the frost away. A surge of helpless anger rose in his chest, not at her, but at the frost, at Amos, at the dead calf, at a God who had crushed something so small and hopeful. He walked over to her. He did not say a word. He unbuttoned his heavy wool coat and took it off. He knelt beside her in the dirt. He wrapped the coat around her shoulders, engulfing her small frame in his warmth. Then he pulled her against his chest. Eliza stiffened for a second, then collapsed into him. She buried her face in his flannel shirt. She did not speak. She did not sob. She just shook, a silent, violent trembling that racked her entire body. Luke held her. He rested his chin on the top of her head. He wrapped his arms around her, shielding her from the view of the empty horizon. It was a tender, heavy moment, weighted with their shared grief. They were two people clinging to a rock in the middle of a raging river. And, for that moment, the rock was each other. 2 days later, the hammer fell. A boy from town rode out to the ranch, tossing a thick envelope onto the porch before galloping away as if the house were plagued. Luke opened it at the kitchen table. It was a legal notice from the bank. It was stark, official, and devoid of mercy. It stated that unless a payment of $200, a significant portion of the principal, was made by the 1st of November, foreclosure proceedings would begin immediately. Luke stared at the paper. It might as well have demanded the moon. He did not have $200. He did not have $20. He slammed his hand down on the table. The plates rattled. "I could ride for the double bar," he said, his voice tight. "They are driving a herd up to the railhead in Wyoming. It is late in the season. It is dangerous work, crossing the passes in the snow. But they are paying triple wages for men willing to risk it." Eliza turned from the stove. She looked at him, her face pale. "You would be gone for weeks." She said, "I would bring back the money," Luke said, avoiding her eyes. "I could save the ranch." "And if the snows trap you?" Eliza asked, her voice quiet. "If the herd stamps, if you do not come back?" Luke looked at her then. "I have to do something. Eliza, I cannot just sit here and let him take it." Eliza walked over to the table. She placed her hand on top of his fist, her touch cool and steady. "I can live in a shack," she said. "I can live in a tent. I have lived with nothing before." "Luke, but I cannot do it alone." She squeezed his hand. "I would rather face hardship here, with you, than live comfortably knowing you were dead in a snowbank somewhere because you were trying to buy us a roof." Luke looked at her, stunned by the ferocity of her quiet statement. She was choosing him. Not the land, not the house. Him. He turned his hand over and gripped hers. "You truly mean that?" "I mean it," she said. "We will find another way, but you stay." The pressure from the town grew uglier. The following week, Eliza went into town to deliver a dress she had finished for Mrs. Gable. She walked with her head high, trying to draw strength from the new foundation she and Luke were building. She entered the general store to buy thread. The clerk, a woman named Martha, who had known Eliza for years, turned her back. "I cannot serve you." "Eliza," Martha said to the shelves. Eliza stood frozen. "Why?" Martha turned around. Her face pinched. "Mrs. McKinnon says she will pull her account if I do business with you. She says you bring bad luck. And after the frost, well, people are saying you brought the cold with you." Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. She turned and walked out, her heart hammering. As she passed the alleyway near the saloon, a hand shot out and grabbed her arm. It was a ranch hand, smelling of stale beer and unwashed wool. "Hey there, quiet girl," he slurred. Eliza tried to pull away, but his grip was iron. Don't run off, he laughed, pulling her closer. I hear you're loosening up these days. Old Luke Carver must be getting something good if he is willing to fight for it. Why don't you share some of that luck with me? Get off me, Eliza gasped, finding her voice. She stomped on his boot. Hard. The man yelped but didn't let go. He raised a hand to slap her. The blow never landed. Luke appeared as if out of the very air. He did not shout. He did not posture. He simply seized the man by the back of his collar and the belt of his trousers and threw him. The ranch hand flew through the air and landed in the dust of the street, skidding on his back. Luke stood over him, his chest heaving, his eyes black with a fury that was barely controlled. His hand hovered near the knife at his belt. Touch her again, Luke said, his voice a low, vibrating growl. And you will not have hands left to touch anyone. Okay. The man scrambled backward, crab walking away in terror. Sheriff Cole stepped off the boardwalk. He walked slowly toward Luke. That is twice. Carver, Cole said. Luke turned to the sheriff. He grabbed my wife. Cole looked at the ranch hand, who was already running toward the saloon, then back at Luke. I did not see that, Cole said flatly. I saw you throw a man in the street. You are disrupting the peace. Luke, again, next time, I put you in irons. Take your wife and get out of my town. Luke stared at the sheriff, realizing that truth held no currency here. He put his arm around Eliza, pulling her tight against his side, and walked her to the wagon. He felt her trembling against him, and it took every ounce of his willpower not to turn around and burn the whole town to the ground. That night, the wind howled around the ranch house like a pack of wolves trying to get in. The fire in the stove cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Eliza sat at the table, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea Luke had made for her. She was still shaking. I'm sorry, she whispered. Luke was pacing the floor. Stop, he said. Do not apologize. Not for them. He stopped pacing and sat down opposite her. He reached across and took her hands. Tell me, he said gently. Tell me about the fire. The real story, not the gossip. Eliza looked into the flames of the stove. She had never told anyone the full truth. It was a knot of shame and terror she carried in her chest. My mother. She was trusting, Eliza began, her voice hollow. She thought the best of men, even when they showed her their worst. There was a man, a drover. He said he loved her. He said he would take us to St. Louis. She swallowed hard. He came over that night drunk. He wanted money she had saved. She told him no. He hit her. Luke squeezed her hands, his knuckles white. I tried to stop him, Eliza said, tears beginning to spill down her cheeks. I was 12. I jumped on his back. He threw me off. I hit the wall. The oil lamp was on the table. It fell. She closed her eyes. The fire moved so fast. It was like it was hungry. The oil spread across the floor. He ran. He just ran and left us. I tried to pull my sister out. I tried to drag my mother. But the smoke... She opened her eyes, looking at Luke with a gaze of utter desolation. I got out. I stood in the snow and watched them burn. And the neighbors. They stood on their porches and watched. And I heard them. One of them said, no surprise. That house was bound for hell anyway. She pulled her hands away from Luke and covered her face. I bring destruction. Luke, I thought if I stayed quiet, if I made myself small, I wouldn't hurt anyone else. But look at us, the frost, the debt, the fights. I am the curse. Luke stood up. He walked around the table and pulled her chair out. He knelt in front of her, pulling her hands away from her face. Look at me, he commanded. Eliza looked at him, her eyes swimming. That was not your fault, Luke said firmly. That was a man's violence and a town's cruelty. You were a child. He took a deep breath. You want to talk about curses? Let me tell you about mine. He looked down at the floor, his voice dropping to a rough whisper. In the war, we took a ridge in Tennessee. There was a boy, a Confederate soldier. He couldn't have been more than 16. He was wounded. He was crying for his mother. Luke looked up at Eliza, his eyes full of pain. My sergeant told me to finish him. We couldn't take prisoners. We were moving too fast. I looked at that boy, and I did it. I pulled the trigger. Eliza gasped softly. I have seen that boy's face every night for 15 years. Luke said, I thought I didn't deserve a home. I thought I didn't deserve peace. And I certainly didn't think I deserved love. I thought I was poisoned inside. He reached up and cupped her face. But you are not a curse, Eliza. You are the only clean, good thing in my life. The only curse is that we let them tell us who we were. Eliza leaned into his hand. The shame that had bound them separately for so long began to dissolve in the light of their shared brokenness. They were not perfect. They were scarred, guilty, and frightened. But they were no longer hiding. Luke stood up and pulled her to her feet. He did not let go. He pulled her against him, and they held each other in the flickering lamplight. They cried quietly, tears soaking into each other's shirts, the sound almost lost beneath the wind. It was a baptism of sorts. When the tears subsided, Luke did not pull away. He looked at her, his eyes dark with a new question. Stay with me tonight, he whispered. Not on the floor. Eliza looked at him. She saw the want in his eyes, but also the respect. He was leaving the gate open, but he would not push her through it. She nodded. Yes, that night, for the first time, they lay together in the narrow bed. It was not a frantic grasping. It was a slow, reverent exploration. Luke touched her as if she were made of something precious and rare, tracing the line of her spine, the curve of her hip. Eliza touched the scars on his chest, claiming them, accepting them, when they finally joined. It was an act of desperate affirmation. It was a reclaiming of their bodies from the past. It was warmth in a cold world, a shelter built of skin and breath. The dawn came clear and cold. The sky was a hard, brilliant blue over the frost-silvered plains. Luke and Eliza stood on the porch, wrapped in blankets, watching the sun crest the horizon. The world looked sharp and dangerous, but beautiful. Eliza leaned her head against Luke's shoulder. I want to stay, she murmured. You are staying, Luke said, resting his cheek on her hair. No, she said, turning to look at him. I mean, I want to belong, somewhere, to someone, by choice. Not because the pastor said so, not because I had nowhere else to go. She reached down and found his hand. She laced her fingers through his, gripping him tight. I choose you. Luke Carver. Luke felt a lump form in his throat. It was the boldest thing he had ever heard. And I choose you. Eliza Ward, he said. The happiness was a fragile glass vessel, and the world was holding a hammer. 3 nights later, the wind picked up again. Luke and Eliza were asleep, tangled together in the bed, deep in the exhaustion of the day's work. Luke woke to a sound, a roar, a crackling sound that was not the wind. He sat up, sniffing the air. Smoke! Eliza! He shouted, shaking her awake. Fire! Eliza woke instantly, her worst nightmare manifesting in the dark. She scrambled out of bed, her heart stopping. They ran to the window. The barn was engulfed. The flames were not licking at the wood. They were devouring it. They roared against the dark sky, casting a hellish orange light over the yard. The sparks flew upward like cruel stars, swirling in the wind, landing on the dry grass, landing on the roof of the house. The house! Luke yelled. They ran outside. The heat was a physical wall. The horses in the corral were screaming, their eyes rolling in terror. Luke ran to the pump. Get buckets! Wet the blankets! Eliza froze. The roar of the fire was the roar of her memory. She saw her mother's face. She felt the heat on her skin. The paralysis seized her. Eliza! Luke's voice cut through the panic. I need you. She looked at him. He was filling a bucket, his face illuminated by the fire. He was not leaving her. He was fighting. She drew in a sharp breath of smoke-tainted air. She pushed the ghost of the past down. She grabbed a bucket. They fought side by side. It was a brutal, desperate battle. They soaked blankets in the freezing water and beat at the sparks that landed on the house roof. They threw bucket after bucket of water onto the side of the house closest to the barn to keep the siding from catching. The heat singed their eyebrows. The smoke filled their lungs, making them cough until they retched. They were blinded by tears and ash. The barn could not be saved. The roof collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending a geyser of sparks into the sky. But the wind shifted. The sparks blew away from the house, out into the barren pasture. They kept wetting the house until the barn was nothing but a glowing skeleton of timber. Luke slumped against the side of the house, gasping for air. His face was black with soot. His hands were blistered. Eliza slid down the wall beside him. She was trembling, but she was alive. Luke looked toward the ruins of the barn. The light of the dying fire illuminated something near the remains of the tack room door. He pushed himself up and walked over, swaying slightly. He kicked at something in the dirt. It was a metal can. He smelled it. Kerosene. He found another one 10 feet away. This was no accident. He rasped, his voice wrecked by smoke. Eliza stood up and walked to him. She saw the cans. Amos, she whispered. Or men paid by him. Luke said, he wanted to burn us out. He looked at the dead barn, all his winter hay, his tools, the last of the tack. It was gone. He looked at Eliza. She was covered in ash, her hair wild, her dress torn. He sank to his knees on the cold, scorched earth. He put his head in his hands. They won. He choked out. They finally won. Eliza dropped to her knees in front of him. She grabbed his wrists and pulled his hands away from his face. No, she said fiercely. Look at the house. Luke! Luke looked. The house stood, scorched, wet, ugly, but standing. They did not win, she said. We are still here. She wrapped her arms around him, pulling him close. They collapsed together on the cold ground, the steam from the wet earth rising around them. They had lost the barn. They had lost their supplies. They were facing ruin. But in that bleak, smoky darkness, as they clung to each other, Luke realized she was right. They were the only shelter left, and for tonight, that had to be enough. The morning after the fire, the sun rose over a landscape that felt like a battlefield. The air still held the acrid bite of wet ash and scorched timber. The barn, once the anchor of the ranch's daily life, was now a blackened skeleton. Its ribs, charred beams that had once held tons of winter hay, pointed accusingly at the sky. Luke stood near the ruins, his face streaked with soot he hadn't fully scrubbed away. He looked at the wreckage with eyes that felt rolled in sand. Financially, this was a death blow. The hay was gone. The tack was destroyed. 2 of the horses were lame from panic-induced injuries. Physically, he was exhausted, his muscles trembling with the aftershocks of adrenaline and labor. Emotionally, he felt hollowed out. He heard the sound of a buggy approaching. He didn't need to look to know who it was. The rhythm of the trotter was too precise, the wheels too well-oiled. Amos McKinnon pulled up to the yard, his buggy gleaming despite the dust. He stepped down, his boots polished to a high shine that seemed obscene against the backdrop of the charred earth. He adjusted his cuffs, his face arranging itself into a mask of solemn concern that didn't reach his eyes. His eyes remained cold, calculating, assessing the damage like an undertaker measuring a corpse. A terrible tragedy. Luke, Amos said, walking toward him. Truly terrible. I saw the smoke from town. Luke leaned against a fence post, too tired to feign politeness. It was kerosene. Amos? Amos didn't flinch. Is that so? Well, accidents happen in dry weather. Lanterns tip. Hay is combustible. It is a hard lesson. But the frontier is a hard teacher. He stopped a few feet away, looking at the house. Then back to Luke. Look at this place, Amos continued, sweeping his hand toward the ruin. You are finished. Luke, you know it. I know it. You have no feed for the winter. You have no equipment. And you still owe the bank a substantial sum that is due in less than a month. Luke stared at the ground. He had no argument. The math was simple, and it was brutal. I am a businessman, Amos said, his voice lowering to a confidential, almost paternal tone. But I am not a monster. I have a solution. Luke looked up, wary. Sell me the deed, Amos said. Today, I will take over the debt. I will absorb the loss of the barn. You keep the house and 10 acres surrounding it. You work for me as the range boss for the consolidated outfit. You will have a wage. You will have security. You will not have to worry about where the next sack of flour is coming from." It was a surrender. It was everything Luke had fought against. It meant becoming a tenant on his own father's land. It meant bowing the knee to the man who had likely ordered the fire. But as Luke looked at the blackened beams, he felt the crushing weight of reality. He had Eliza to think of. He couldn't ask her to starve. He couldn't ask her to freeze. Luke started, his voice cracking. "We cannot accept that." The voice was quiet, but it cut through the heavy air like a razor. Amos turned. Luke turned. Eliza stood on the porch. She was wearing a dress that was stained with soot and water, her hair pulled back in a severe, messy braid. She looked exhausted, small, and visibly shaking. But her chin was lifted, and her eyes were fixed on Amos with a terrifying clarity. She stepped down from the porch and walked toward them. "The terms are unfair," she said, stopping beside Luke. "The barn was destroyed by arson. We need time to rebuild. We need time to investigate. We will not sell the land for a fraction of its worth just because you are standing over the ashes." Amos looked at her, and for the first time, his mask slipped completely. His lip curled in a sneer of pure disdain. "Mrs. Carver," he said, drawing out the name as if it were a bad joke. "You should be careful. You are lucky to have a roof over your head at all. A woman with your history should be grateful for any scrap of respectability she can find. You do not understand business. You understand charity, which is what this is." The insult hung in the air, dripping with classism and moral judgment. He was reminding her of the saloon, of the gossip, of her place at the bottom of the social ladder. Eliza did not flinch. She did not look down. She held his gaze, her eyes hard and bright. "I understand theft, Mr. McKinnon," she said, "and I recognize it when I see it." Luke felt a surge of heat in his chest that had nothing to do with the fire. It was pride, fierce, burning pride. She was standing up to the most powerful man in the county, a man who could crush them with a signature, and she was not blinking. He stepped forward, placing himself shoulder to shoulder with her. "You heard my wife," Luke said, his voice finding its old steel. "We are not selling. Not today." Amos looked from one to the other. His face hardened into stone. "Very well," he said, turning back to his buggy. "But understand this. The deadline stands. If the money is not on my desk by the 1st of November, I will return with Sheriff Cole and an eviction order, and you will leave with nothing but the clothes on your backs." He climbed into the buggy and snapped the reins. The horse trotted away, leaving them standing in the smell of ash and defiance. That night, the sky was heavy with low, gray clouds that hid the moon. The darkness was absolute, save for the faint glow of the lantern Luke had hung on the porch. They stood near the charred frame of the barn. The blackened beams looked like the broken ribs of some great beast, picked clean by vultures. "We have 3 weeks, Luke said. "I can sell the saddle horses. I can sell my rifle. It will not be enough." Eliza wrapped her shawl tighter around herself. "It is not about the money. Luke, even if we paid him, he would find another way. He burnt the barn. Next time it will be the house. Or the herd." Luke kicked a piece of charcoal. "I know. But what can we do? He owns the law. He owns the bank." Eliza looked at him. Her face was shadowed, but her voice was steady. "We have to speak," she said. Luke frowned. "Speak. We have to tell the truth." Eliza said, "All of it. To everyone." Luke shook his head. "Eliza, the town hates us. They think you are a witch and I'm a brawler. They will not listen. They listen to rumors because that is all they have." She insisted. "They listen to Amos because he is the only one talking. We have to challenge him, publicly. We have to force them to see the injustice." "It is dangerous," Luke said. "Hiding has not protected us," Eliza cried out, her voice cracking. "My silence did not save my mother. It did not save the barn. It is only protecting Amos." Luke looked at her. He saw the desperation in her eyes, but also the logic. They were cornered. They had nothing left to lose but the truth. He reached out and took her hand. It was cold and rough from the work of fighting the fire. "You are right," he whispered. The next afternoon, Pastor Green rode out to the ranch. He looked older than Luke remembered. His shoulders were slumped, and his face was drawn. He stopped his horse at the edge of the yard and stared at the ruins of the barn. He sat there for a long time before dismounting. Luke and Eliza came out to meet him. They did not invite him in. They stood on the porch, a united front. I saw the smoke, Pastor Green said, his voice heavy. I came to see if you were unharmed. We are alive, Luke said flatly. Green looked at Eliza. He saw the soot stained into her dress. He saw the way she stood. Not behind her husband, but beside him. He saw the weary determination in their faces. This is a heavy blow, Green said. Was it lightning? It was kerosene. Eliza said. Green blinked. Kerosene? Cans were found, Luke added. Tipped over near the tack room? Green looked horrified. But who would do such a thing? Eliza stepped forward. You know who. Pastor. The same man who sat in your parlor and told you to marry me off to secure a debt. Green paled. He looked away, unable to meet her gaze. Pastor, Eliza said, her voice quiet but clear. You told me to be quiet. You told me to be good. You said it would save me. But silence has only fed the fire. Amos McKinnon has threatened us. He has manipulated the banknotes, and now he has burned our winter feed because we would not sell the land to him. She took a breath. My mother died because a man wanted what was not his, and the town looked the other way. I will not let that happen to us. Green looked back at her. He saw the little girl he had preached at, the woman he had treated as a problem to be solved, and he saw his own failure reflected in her eyes. He had chosen order over justice. He had chosen the comfort of the wealthy over the safety of the vulnerable. He took a handkerchief from his pocket and wiped his brow. I have been blind, he admitted, his voice trembling. Or perhaps I simply closed my eyes. He looked at the barn again. This cannot stand. If we allow this in Silver Mesa, we are building a town on rot. He straightened his spine. I will call a meeting. Tomorrow, in the church. We will call it a discussion of community safety. Will Amos be there? Luke asked. He is a deacon, Green said. He will be there. The day of the meeting was gray and oppressive. The clouds hung low over the plains, a ceiling of slate that seemed to press down on the steeple of the church. The air was still and cold. The church was full. News of the fire had spread, and curiosity had drawn the townspeople out. They sat in the pews, murmuring, glancing at the door. When Luke and Eliza walked in, the whispering stopped. They walked up the center aisle. Luke wore his best coat, though it was threadbare at the cuffs. Eliza wore her gray dress, clean and pressed, her head held high. They sat in the second pew. Eliza clasped her hands tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Amos McKinnon sat in the front pew, to the right. Sheriff Cole sat beside him, his hat resting on his knee. Amos looked confident, almost bored. He nodded to people as they entered, the picture of a benevolent patriarch. Pastor Green walked to the pulpit. He did not open his Bible. He gripped the edges of the wood with both hands. Friends, he began, his voice echoing in the hush. We are gathered here because a calamity has struck one of our neighbors. The Carver barn has burned. A murmur went through the room. But, Green continued, his voice rising, fire is not the only danger we face. There is a danger in silence. There is a danger in turning away from the truth. He looked down at Luke and Eliza. I have invited Mrs. Carver to speak, Green said. A shockwave went through the room. People leaned forward. The quietest woman in town, speaking? Amos stiffened. He turned his head sharply to look at the pastor, his eyes narrowing. Eliza stood up. Her legs felt like water. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard she thought it might crack them. She walked slowly to the front of the church. The floorboards creaked under her boots. A lonely, terrified sound. She turned to face the congregation. She saw Mrs. Gable. She saw the women who had turned their backs on her. She saw the men who had jeered. The church felt like a box closing in, suffocating her. But then she looked at Luke. He was watching her, his face full of fierce, unshakable belief. She took a breath. I know what you say about me, she said. Her voice was small, wavering. She swallowed and started again. Louder. I know what you say about me. You say I have bad blood. You say I bring tragedy. You say I burned my mother's house. The room was deathly silent. My mother was not a bad woman. Eliza said she was a frightened woman. She died because a man she trusted became violent when she refused to give him money. He knocked over a lamp. He ran away and left us to burn. She looked at Amos. I learned that night that the truth does not matter to people who have already made up their minds. So I stopped speaking. I became a ghost because it was safer. She took a step forward. But silence did not save me. Mr. McKinnon came to me and told me I had to marry Luke Carver or I would be run out of town. He told Luke he had to marry me or he would lose his ranch. He created a problem so he could solve it and keep us both under his thumb. Amos stood up abruptly. This is outrageous, he shouted. Pastor, are you going to let this woman spew lies in the house of God? Sit down. Amos, Green said sharply. Eliza continued, her voice gaining strength, fueled by years of suppressed rage. We tried to pay the debt. We worked. But when we refused to sell the land to him last week, he threatened us. And 3 nights later, our barn burned. We found kerosene cans. It is a lie, Amos bellowed, his face turning red. She is unstable. She is a hysteric. She burned that barn herself for attention, just like she did when she was a child. Luke stood up. He did not shout. He spoke with a quiet, deadly power that carried to the back of the room. I have lived with this woman for months, Luke said. I have seen her work until her hands bled. I have seen her save my cattle in a storm. I have seen her kindness when she had every reason to be cruel. She is not unstable. She is the bravest person in this room. He looked at Amos. And she is telling the truth. Sheriff Cole stood up slowly. He looked at Amos, then at Eliza. Mrs. Carver, Cole said, his voice measured. You say you found cans? Yes, Eliza said, by the tack room. And the threats? Cole asked. When were they made? Tuesday, Luke answered. In the yard. He told us if we didn't sell, he would return with an eviction order. A man in the back stood up. It was Mr. Henderson, the owner of the livery stable. Amos told me last year he'd call my note if I didn't vote for the water rights bill, Henderson said, his voice shaking slightly. He squeezes people. Another man, a ranch hand named Pete, who worked for the Double Bar, stood up. I saw 2 fellas near the Carver place on the night of the fire, Pete said, twisting his hat in his hands. Strangers. They were riding hard toward town. I didn't think much of it then, but the room shifted. It was a physical sensation, like a tide turning. The fear that had kept the town silent began to crack. People looked at Amos not with reverence, but with recognition. They saw the pattern. Pastor Green stepped down from the pulpit. He walked to Eliza and took her hand. I owe you an apology. Eliza, he said, his voice breaking, I did not listen. I treated you as a burden. I failed you as a pastor and as a man. Amos looked around the room. He saw the shift. He saw his power dissolving like sugar in hot water. You are all fools, Amos screamed. Losing control. I built this town. I own this town. If you turn on me, I will call every debt in this valley. I will ruin every last one of you. It was a confession. The mask was gone, revealing the contempt and greed that had always roiled beneath. Sheriff Cole stepped out of the pew. He walked over to Amos. That is enough. Mr. McKinnon, Cole said. You work for me. Amos spat. I work for the law, Cole said, his voice hard. And based on these testimonies and the circumstantial evidence regarding the arson, I am opening an official investigation. Amos stared at him, his mouth opening and closing. He looked at the faces of the townspeople. Hostile, awake, no longer cowed. He sat down heavily, a man whose empire had just crumbled into dust. The meeting ended in a chaotic murmur, but Luke and Eliza did not stay for the aftermath. They walked out of the church, hand in hand, into the cool afternoon air. The clouds were breaking. Shafts of pale sunlight were piercing the gray, illuminating the wet street. They walked to the side of the church, away from the crowd, into a quiet corner sheltered by an old oak tree. Eliza leaned against the rough bark, her legs finally giving out. She slid down until she was crouching, her head on her knees. Luke knelt beside her. He put his hand on her back. "Eliza," he said softly. She looked up. Her face was wet with tears, but they were not tears of grief. "You did it," Luke said. "I have never seen anything like that. You faced them all down. I was terrified," she whispered. "I know," Luke said. "That is why it was brave." He looked at her with an expression of profound awe. He was proud of her, not just as a husband, but as a witness to her survival. She had taken the thing that terrified her most, being seen, being heard, and she had used it as a weapon to save them. Eliza looked at him. She felt lighter. The weight she had carried since she was 12 years old, the weight of the town's judgment, the weight of the secret, the weight of her own shame, was gone. It had been shouted out in the church and dissolved in the air. She leaned into him. Luke wrapped his arms around her, pulling her tight against his chest. He buried his face in her neck, breathing in the scent of her. The wind tugged at her hair, pulling strands loose from her braid. It carried the voices from the church away, leaving them in a bubble of quiet. This embrace was different. It was not the desperate clinging in the mud after the fire. It was solid. It was a pact. "Whatever happens next," Luke whispered into her hair. "The investigation, the debt, the winter. We face it together." "Together," Eliza echoed. She pulled back slightly to look at him. "I am not the quietest woman in town anymore," she said, a small, tired smile touching her lips. Luke smiled back, the expression breaking through the exhaustion on his face. "No," he said. "You are the loudest thing I have ever heard, and I love you for it." He kissed her then, a soft, lingering pressure that sealed the vow. They stood up together, brushed the dirt from their clothes, and turned to face the world, not as a man and a woman forced into a corner, but as partners who had burned down the lies to build something true. The weeks that followed the town meeting were a slow, grinding turning of wheels that had been rusted shut for years. Sheriff Cole was not a man of dramatic gestures. He was a man of ink, paper, and patient silence. He moved through Silver Mesa like a shadow, interviewing the ranch hand who had seen the strangers near the Carver place, taking a statement from the livery owner about Amos's threats, and spending long, quiet hours in the back room of the bank, staring at ledgers that Amos McKinnon had thought were beyond scrutiny. Cole found the rot. It was buried deep in columns of figures and interest rates that shifted like sand. He found properties foreclosed upon weeks before deadlines, cattle counts that did not match sale records, and payments recorded as late when witnesses swore they were on time. It was a tapestry of fraud woven by a man who believed himself to be the only god in the valley. While the law worked its slow magic in town, the land offered no such patience to Luke and Eliza. The calendar said it was late autumn, a time when the earth should have been resting, but the weather remained volatile. A late snow fell unexpectedly in the second week of November. It was heavy and wet, a concrete weight that snapped the remaining fence posts Luke had not yet repaired and smothered the few shoots of green grass that had dared to poke through the frost. Survival remained a daily, bruising struggle. The loss of the winter feed in the barn fire meant that the cattle were growing thinner by the day. Luke had to ride out every morning, breaking ice on the creek and driving the herd miles to find scrub brush in the sheltered canyons. But the center of their world had shifted. It was no longer the house, but the black scar where the barn had stood. They began to rebuild. They did not have the money to hire a crew, and despite the change in the town's attitude, most men were busy winterizing their own spreads. So, Luke and Eliza did it themselves. They worked side by side in the biting cold. The air was so frigid that their breath hung in clouds around their heads, misting their faces. Luke felled the timber in the high copse 3 miles away, dragging the logs down with the horses. Eliza stripped the bark, her hands raw and chapped despite the gloves Luke had bought her. They mixed mortar for the foundation stones, hauling water from the creek until their shoulders burned. It was brutal, back-breaking labor, but it became an act of defiance. Every nail Luke hammered was a testament that he was staying. Every board Eliza sanded was a declaration that she was no longer a ghost. One afternoon, they were trying to lift a heavy support beam into place. It was greenwood, heavy with sap and moisture. Luke had one end, his boot slipping in the mud. Eliza had the other, her face red with exertion, her teeth gritted. On 3, Luke grunted. 1, 2, 3! They heaved. The beam rose, wavered, and then slipped from Luke's grasp. It crashed down into the mud, splashing them both with freezing slime. Luke let out a roar of frustration. Kicking the beam. It is no use. It is too heavy. He looked at Eliza, expecting to see tears or fear. Instead, she was looking at him. Mud dripping from her nose, her hair plastered to her cheek. She started to giggle. It was a rusty sound at first. Then it bloomed into a full, chest-deep laugh. Luke stared at her. "What is funny? You—" she gasped, wiping mud from her eyes. "You look like a bog monster." Luke looked down at himself. He was caked in brown sludge from chest to toe. He looked back at her. "You are not exactly a rose yourself." "Mrs. Carver," he said, a grin cracking his muddy face. He started to laugh too. They stood there in the freezing wind, covered in mud, laughing until their sides ached. It was a tight laughter, bordering on hysteria. But it was not despair. It was the sound of two people who had looked into the abyss and decided to make a joke of it. "Help me lift this bog monster," Eliza said, wiping her face. Luke stepped back to the beam. They leaned on each other, shoulder to shoulder, bracing their bodies together to create a strength neither had alone. This time, the beam held. The community, moved by the sight of the two of them working in the snow and by the echo of Eliza's testimony, began to stir. It started small. Mr. Henderson, the livery owner, rode out one morning with a wagon full of seasoned lumber. "I had some spare boards from the new stall I never built," he mumbled, looking at his boots. "Thought you might use them." "No charge." A few days later, Mrs. Gable arrived in a buggy. She walked up the porch steps stiffly, holding a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "I brought some stew," she said to Eliza, "and a loaf of yeast bread. A working woman has no time to bake." She paused, looking at Eliza's chapped hands. "I also have some salve in the shop. For the cracks, you come by and get it." "Thank you," Eliza said, her voice steady. "Mrs." Gable nodded once, sharp and quick. "You are a good seamstress." "Eliza, I have a backlog of orders. If you want the work, it is yours." Eliza watched her go, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the stew. The town was not welcoming her with a parade, but they were opening the door. Amos McKinnon felt the walls closing in. He walked the streets of Silver Mesa, but the men who used to tip their hats now looked away. The silence that greeted him was not the silence of respect. It was the silence of judgment. He became desperate. He sent a threatening letter to Mr. Henderson, warning him about old debts. He tried to burn a stack of loan agreements in the alley behind the bank late one night, but Sheriff Cole was watching. Cole stepped out of the shadows just as Amos struck the match. "I would not do that." "Amos," Cole said, his voice calm. Amos spun around, the match flickering in his trembling hand. "You have no authority here. Cole, this is my property." "Evidence is not property," Cole said, walking forward and blowing out the match. "It belongs to the court." 2 days later, the warrant was signed. Sheriff Cole walked into the bank at noon. He did not do it quietly. He walked in through the front doors, followed by 2 deputies from the county seat. "Amos McKinnon," Cole said, his voice ringing off the marble floors. "You are under arrest for arson, fraud, and extortion." Amos stood up behind his desk, his face purple. "You cannot do this. I am Silver Mesa. Put your hands out," Cole said, unhooking the handcuffs from his belt. They let him out. Amos, who had always ridden in fine carriages, was marched down the center of the main street. His hands were bound in iron. His coat was rumpled. The townspeople came out of the shops to watch. They did not cheer. They just watched. They saw a man who had been a giant revealed as nothing more than a thief in a silk suit. The sight of him, diminished and furious, walking toward the jailhouse, signaled the end of an era. The fear broke. The legal proceedings that followed were messy. Amos hired expensive lawyers from the city. There were people who still defended him, fearing the economic collapse of the town without his capital. But the dam had broken. Luke's debt was not erased, Banks do not work that way. But it was frozen and transferred to a county holding authority while the fraud investigation continued. The immediate, suffocating threat of foreclosure was lifted. The interest rates were recalculated to a legal standard. For the first time in 2 years, Luke Carver could look at his ranch and know that if he worked hard, he could keep it. The invisible noose was gone. By December, the new barn was finished. It was not as large as the old one, but it was sturdy. The fresh-cut pine shone pale and bright against the gray-weathered timber of the house. It smelled of resin and hope. Eliza had changed too. She was still quiet by nature. She would never be a woman who chattered to fill the silence, but the quality of her silence had shifted. It was peaceful, not fearful. She joined the sewing circle at the church hall. She sat with the other women, stitching and listening. When she did speak, offering an opinion on a pattern or a story about the ranch, the women stopped to listen. They had learned that when Eliza Ward spoke, it was worth hearing. One evening, after a long day of moving the cattle to the lower pasture, Luke and Eliza walked together up the ridge behind the house. The sun was setting, turning the vast, snow-dusted plains into a sheet of hammered gold. The wind had finally lost its bite. It blew gently from the west, brushing through the tall, stiff grass with a whispering sound. The sky was a masterpiece of winter light, streaks of pink, amber, and violet stretching over the distant blue mountains. They stood side by side, looking out over the land that had tried so hard to kill them. Luke took a deep breath, the cold air filling his lungs. He looked at Eliza. Her cheeks were pink from the wind, her eyes bright. She looked solid, real. "Eliza," he said. She turned to him. "When the pastor called me to his house that day," Luke began, searching for the words. "When he told me I had to marry you, I thought my life was over. I thought the walls were closing in. I thought you were just one more heavy thing I had to carry, like the debt or the drought." He reached out and took her gloved hand. "I was a fool," he said softly. Eliza watched him, her expression tender. "You were not a fool." "Luke," she said, "you were trapped. We both were." Luke shook his head. "No, I was blind. I looked at you and I saw a burden. But now I look at you and I see the only reason I'm still standing here. You stood with me when the whole town turned their backs. You walked into that church and faced your worst nightmare to save a pile of burnt wood and a man who had been nothing but gruff to you." He squeezed her hand. "You are the strongest person I have ever known." Eliza looked down at their joined hands. A small smile touched her lips. "I used to believe the stories," she admitted, her voice low. "I believed I was cursed. I thought I carried a fire inside me that would burn anyone who got too close. That is why I never touched anyone. That is why I never spoke. I was trying to protect the world from me." She looked up at him, her eyes shining. "But standing beside you, fighting the fire with you, I realized something. The fire is not a curse. It is just heat. It depends on what you do with it. You can let it burn you up, or you can use it to keep warm." She stepped closer to him. "You gave my fire a hearth. Luke, you gave it a place to burn where it doesn't hurt anyone." The conversation dropped away. The words had been spoken, and now they were just two bodies standing on a ridge in the vast, emptying light. Luke studied her face. He saw the scar of her past, but he also saw the future. "Eliza," he said, and this time, it was a question that came from the deepest part of him. "The debt is under control. The town is listening. The barn is built. You have choices now. You have a trade. You could leave. You could go anywhere." He paused, his heart thudding against his ribs. "Do you choose to stay?" It was the question that had hung between them since the wedding day. Was she here because she had to be, or because she wanted to be? Eliza did not hesitate. She smiled, and it was a radiant thing, breaking across her face like the sunrise. "Luke," she said, "I chose you the night of the storm. I chose you the night I kissed you in the dark, when I thought the world was ending. I decided then that I would rather burn with you than be safe alone." She reached up and touched his face, her thumb tracing the line of his jaw. I choose you now, she whispered. Fully, freely. I am not going anywhere. This is my home. You are my home. Luke let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 6 months. The background hum of the plains, the rustling grass, the distant call of a hawk, faded away. The world narrowed down to the woman standing in front of him. He pulled her in. The kiss was not like the first one. It was not desperate. It was not a collision of fears. It was slow. It was deep. It was unhurried. It was the kiss of two people who had fought a war back to back and had won the right to peace. It tasted of the cold wind and the warm promise of the future. It was a current of steady, consuming love that ran through them, binding them together stronger than any legal paper ever could. Luke held her as if she were the anchor that kept him from drifting off the earth. Eliza melted into him, no longer a ghost seeking to disappear, but a woman who had finally found the place where she fit. They walked back down the ridge in the twilight, the first stars appearing in the purple sky. Later, inside the house, the fire in the stove crackled cheerfully. The room was warm. The shadows were no longer threatening. They were cozy. That night, in the quiet of their home, they shared an intimacy that went beyond the physical. It was a night of reverence. Luke touched her scars with hands that had built a barn and fought a mob. Eliza held him with arms that had carried water and mended fences. There were whispered promises in the dark, words that didn't need to be shouted to be true. There was soft laughter, a sound that chased the last ghosts out of the corners of the room. They explored the geography of each other with a sense of wonder, claiming and being claimed. It was the sealing of the bond, two people who had been broken by the world, fitting their jagged edges together to make something whole. The next morning, the dawn arrived with a pale, clean light. It spilled over the ridge, touching the roof of the new barn, turning the wood gold. It lit up the patches on the fences. It shone on the simple, weather-beaten house. Inside, Luke and Eliza woke tangled together. Luke's arm was thrown over her waist. Her head was resting on his chest. They lay there for a long time, listening to the silence. It was a good silence, a full silence. Eventually, the day called. There were cattle to feed. There was ice to break. They were still poor, the land was still hard. The winter would still be long, but as they dressed and drank their coffee, passing the cup back and forth, there was a lightness in the room. They stepped out onto the porch together. The wind was blowing, cold and wild, smelling of sagebrush and snow. The western landscape stretched out before them, miles of untamed earth, indifferent to their lives. It was not safe. It was not easy. But Luke and Eliza stood shoulder to shoulder, their arms touching. They looked out at the horizon, and they were not afraid. They were partners. They had walked through the fire, and they had come out the other side carrying the flame. Their love burned steady and bright against the gray morning, a quiet, unshakable force that promised to endure whatever the wild frontier threw at them next. Thank you so much for listening to the story of Luke and Eliza. It has been a journey through the dust, the fire, and the quiet resilience of the human heart. I hope you felt the cold wind of Silver Mesa and the warmth of their hard-won love. I would love to know where you are listening from today. Please leave a comment below and tell me which part of the story touched you the most. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to From Wild West. We have many more stories of the frontier, of grit, romance, and survival, waiting to be told. Share your thoughts in English in the comments. I read every single one. Until next time, keep your fires burning bright.